Welcome to the Debunkers Podcast. Have you ever felt that current political discourse? Well, it often feels less like a genuine debate, hashing out ideas, and more like, a dismantling. Less about finding common ground, maybe, and more about discrediting, dividing, and ultimately consolidating power. It's a feeling that kind of cuts across the usual political lines, I think, wherever you stand.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way. It's less about policy, more about posture, maybe.
Exactly. Posture, and maybe something more strategic. Which brings us to today. We're embarking on a deep dive to explore whether certain modern political leaders, and we're talking big names here, like Donald Trump in the U.S. and Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, and his successor Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, whether they might actually be operating from a shared, kind of remarkably consistent authoritarian playbook.
That's precisely right. And our goal here isn't just to skim the surface, react to the latest tweet or headline. We want to really dig into these sources to see if there are common underlying strategies and tactics actually at play.
Right.
We'll be pulling specific examples, highlighting some pretty surprising similarities. And just to be clear up front, our aim isn't to pass judgment, definitely not endorsing any particular viewpoint here.
No, absolutely not.
Instead, it's about a rigorous analysis, looking at the patterns of behavior these leaders exhibit. And crucially, we'll examine what these patterns might imply, for the health and the future of democratic institutions in their countries. It's really about recognizing the mechanics, the political maneuvering, understanding not just what happened, but the how and the why.
And in true deep dive fashion, you, listening, can expect to walk away with some genuinely surprising nuggets of knowledge. We promise. We'll keep the conversation insightful, engaging, hopefully with just enough humor and, let's be honest, dry wit to keep you hooked.
Because these topics can get heavy.
They really can. But staying well informed on complex stuff shouldn't feel like homework, right? So think of this as your shortcut to quickly but thoroughly understanding a really critical, evolving aspect of contemporary politics. Settle in, because this is going to be, I think, a revealing and pretty analytical journey into the subtle and sometimes not so subtle world of modern political power.
Let's do it.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this authoritarian playbook, we need to start where a lot of these strategies seem to kick off by eroding public trust. This brings us straight into part one, the art of degradation, or as we're maybe cheekily calling it, trash-talking democracy and delegitimizing information.
Yeah. It does sound a bit dramatic, doesn't it? Trash-talking democracy.
It sounds like something from a bad sports movie, maybe.
But it isn't just political hyperbole, is it? It's actually a deliberate strategy. Oh, absolutely. It's totally calculated. Our sources, particularly the research by Sella and his colleagues, they define this democratic trash talk very specifically. It's rhetoric designed to diminish public perceptions of the quality, the fairness, or, the basic effectiveness of democracy itself.
Not just a policy, but the whole system.
Exactly. Or its core institutions as they operate in the speaker's own country. So this isn't just like criticizing a bad law or slamming the opposition party. It's about pushing the idea, planting the seed that the entire system is already fundamentally broken, that it's corrupt, it's dysfunctional, the end goal to really erode public faith in the very foundations of how the nation is governed.
Okay, but strategically, what's the advantage? If the system is supposedly broken, why keep hammering that point? What's the play?
Oh, well, that's the really insidious part, isn't it? And it's what the Sella study brings out so clearly. It's about the underlying purpose. See, if citizens are already convinced that democracy is basically in shambles, right? Then when leaders take really drastic actions like attacking the courts or, vilifying the press or casting doubt on election results,
then people are less likely to push back.
Precisely. Public resistance is significantly dulled. The logic they're selling is effectively, hey, nothing of value is lost here because these institutions were already deemed worthless, right?
Yeah.
It acts like a preemptive psychological strike. It softens the ground, prepares the public to accept future power grabs.
Gotcha.
And this is really different from just, say, pure partisan polarization, which usually focuses on demonizing the hated other side, the opposition. Trash talk, in its purest form, it sort of whispers to the public, look, don't worry about my attacks. These institutions are rotten anyway. I'm just clearing out the trash. It's like creating an intellectual precondition for accepting, authoritarian shifts.
The classic, it was always terrible, so I'm just putting it out of its misery argument. Wow, that really resonates. Okay, let's pivot then. Focus on Mexico for a moment, because President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, he seems to have delivered a masterclass in this exact strategy. often from his daily platform, those presidential mañaneras, those famously long morning press conferences.
Oh, he absolutely has. The Cell et al. Study, they meticulously analyzed AMLO's rhetoric, and their findings are, frankly, eye-opening. His daily morning press conferences gave them this enormous trove of rhetoric. I mean, get this, over 11,155 conferences analyzed, nearly 300,000 sentences spoken by him between late 2018 and October 2023.
Wow, that's a lot of talking.
It's an unprecedented amount of public address, and their sophisticated text-as-data analysis revealed something really crucial. AMLO actually spent more time trash-talking his own country's democracy than he did just, deepening partisan polarization, attacking opponents.
Really, more time attacking the system than the other side.
Yes. This wasn't just some side theme or a rhetorical flourish he used now and then. It was central. It was consistent. A meticulously applied strategy in his communication.
So his main focus wasn't just rallying his base against the opposition. It was actively, day in, day out, telling everyone that the entire system was fundamentally rotten. Who were his main targets in this grand performance of institutional degradation?
Yeah, he had his favorites. His specific targets, as detailed in the study, they included really key independent institutions in Mexico. We're talking about the Mexican courts, the National Electoral Institute, the INE, which is absolutely vital for fair elections.
Right, the election watchdog.
Exactly. Yeah. Also the central bank, Banxico, plus universities, the press, and various civil society organizations. And AMLO's criticism, it wasn't just some vague complaint like, oh, things aren't working. He specifically accused these institutions of being autonomous of the people rather than just, autonomous of the executive branch.
Ah, that's a subtle twist.
It's a subtle but profoundly significant linguistic twist, right? It implies their independence serves some shadowy elite agenda, not the public good. And his choice of language, well, it was far from subtle. Mexican analysts noted his preferred insults, his epithets for these institutions and their leaders. Things like hypocrite, racist, social climber, know-it-all, and thief ratero in Spanish.
Charming. Just delightful vocabulary for a head of state. Like a benevolent uncle. If that uncle had a very specific, very cutting vocabulary aimed at anyone who dared disagree.
Exactly. It's designed not just to critique, but to thoroughly dehumanize and delegitimize. And what's also really revealing is the contrast the study highlights. AMLO's rhetoric rarely, almost never, targeted military institutions.
Oh, interesting.
Get this, only a minuscule 4% of his mentions of military entities were critical. Compare that to a whopping 30% for non-military public institutions.
So the institutions he relies on, or maybe fears less, get a pass.
It certainly suggests that some institutions are considered more broken than others, depending perhaps on their utility to his agenda, or maybe their potential for independent pushback. It's a very, very selective form of criticism.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
The selective erosion of trust. Okay, so if AMLO was systematically trash-talking Mexico's institutions, let's look north. Because Donald Trump's approach, for many of us listening, might sound eerily, almost disturbingly familiar.
The parallels are definitely striking. Trump's whole fake news offensive, as analyzed by McKinnon, it followed a remarkably similar pattern of delegitimization. His just relentless discrediting of the media, especially whenever he faced criticism.
Which was often.
Which is very often, yes. It had a profound and, measurable effect on his followers' perceptions. He wasn't just complaining about bad press. He took direct action. He threatened press credentials for outlets like the New York Times. He famously labeled CNN disgusting. This isn't just, expressing displeasure. It's an active, aggressive attempt to control the flow of information and, maybe more importantly, to utterly undermine the credibility of any source that isn't directly controlled by him or overtly favorable to him.
And the consequence of that, naturally, was this widespread distrust in traditional media, right? Mm-hmm. At least among his base.
Exactly. The whole era of fake news that he really championed led to major distrust among his followers towards pretty much all mainstream media outlets. He masterfully framed the media as, and this is infamous, the enemy of the American people.
A phrase with a long, dark history.
A very long, dark history, as Kalb notes in McKinnon's analysis, yeah. Echoing authoritarian rhetoric throughout history. But here's the, shall we say, predictable caveat. Fox News, curiously enough, was almost always exempt from this enemy list.
Funny.
Isn't it just? It's almost as if the definition of fake news was simply news that isn't praising me or news that doesn't fit my narrative. This kind of selective delegitimization, it leaves followers with fewer and fewer sources they perceive as credible, ultimately funneling them towards the leader's preferred narrative, his reality.
Okay, so the strategy seems remarkably consistent across both examples. First, you systematically break down trust in democratic institutions, the courts, the elections, whatever. Then you similarly dismantle trust in independent information sources, the media especially. But what does this systematic degradation actually do to people's attitudes? I mean, does it actually work on a broad scale? Does it change minds?
Well, the Saladell study in Mexico actually tested this directly. They conducted a survey experiment, which is fascinating. They exposed participants to AMLO's actual trash-talking rhetoric and found that it significantly increased anti-democratic attitudes among Mexicans.
Increased, not just reinforced existing views.
Increased them. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just an effect confined to his supporters in some echo chamber. This impact was observed across the board among AMLO's existing supporters, yes, but also among opposition supporters, and crucially, among nonpartisan voters, people with no strong prior allegiance.
Wow, so it's corrosive for everyone.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests, that this kind of rhetoric is broadly corrosive. It eats away at fundamental democratic norms and principles, irrespective of your pre-existing political leanings. It suggests a more profound, almost systemic erosion of democratic belief itself.
That's actually quite chilling. So even if you didn't particularly like AMLO, his constant attacks on institutions still made you, maybe subconsciously, more accepting of anti-democratic ideas.
Precisely. The study detailed specific increases. Support for demonstrably anti-democratic ideas went up, like support for firing judges, up by a significant 7.4 percentage points.
So for hearing the rhetoric?
It's from exposure to the rhetoric. Same for supporting disobeying judicial decisions or reducing institutional autonomy, or just a general embrace of what the researchers called institutional nihilism.
Institutional nihilism sounds bleak.
It is bleak. It's this pervasive belief that institutions are just inherently worthless or maybe beyond repair. It's almost as if people were subtly being told, hey, nothing to see here, folks. These courts were always terrible, so don't sweat it if they get undermined or, dismantled.
Wow.
And interestingly, there was a slight nuance. The study observed that only AMLO supporters were actually convinced by his claims that the courts were highly corrupt.
All right.
Non-partisans and opposition supporters. They didn't necessarily buy into that specific factual claim, right? But, and this is key, they still developed these broader anti-democratic attitudes.
So the feeling stuck, even if the facts didn't.
Exactly. It highlights how powerful emotional appeals and just consistent negative framing can be. They can kind of bypass rational scrutiny, chipping away at democratic faith, even when the specific facts being alleged don't fully stick for everyone. It's about the constant negativity.
Okay, so once you've effectively trash-talked the referees, you've convinced everyone the game is rigged anyway. What's the logical next step in this authoritarian playbook?
You start taking over the scoreboard, right? Maybe even rewriting the rule book itself.
That seems to be the pattern.
Which brings us neatly to part 2. The executive's embrace, or, the strategic process of centralizing power and actively undermining checks and balances. It's all about consolidating authority, pulling power into the executive branch.
Yes, and this is where the McKinnon paper offers a really useful framework. It talks about stages of authoritarianism. It analyzes Trump and AMLO and throws Putin into the mix for comparison as being in different stages of authoritarianism.
Okay, different stages, like levels in a game. Sort of, yeah. Putin, obviously, is positioned way out there in the latest stage, having achieved, extensive, if not total control over state institutions in Russia. Trump, conversely, McKinnon categorizes as early stage, meaning he certainly showed clear authoritarian tendencies, absolutely had the intentions, but ultimately, during his presidency, McKinnon argues he has not been able to change anything at all in terms of actually absorbing institutions into executive control. The system held, more or less.
Okay. And AMLO, where does he fit?
AMLO is pegged as middle stage, described as just now beginning to change actual legislation and rules for elections. This suggests a really crucial shift, moving beyond just the rhetoric, the trash talk, into concrete systemic alterations to the rules of the game.
Right, from words to actions.
Exactly. So this framework, it sets up a vital comparison for understanding the specific tactics these leaders used, and also their differing levels of success, let's say, in consolidating executive power.
Okay, so AMLO and his Morena party in Mexico. They've apparently been quite busy on the legislative and judicial fronts, not just talking the talk, but walking the walk towards that middle stage.
Extremely busy, and with considerable success, it seems. Sources from the Atlantic Council and Mayor Brown, they detail a very clear and frankly aggressive concentration of power under AMLO. Remember, he came to power in 2018 as a left-leaning populist. He immediately started making changes that strongly favored the role of the state.
And this continued, or even ramped up, under Sheinbaum.
It absolutely accelerated under his hand-picked successor, Claudia Sheinbaum. Look at this. The ruling Morena party achieved a legislative supermajority in the Chamber of Deputies. They control a staggering 73% of the seats.
73%. With how much of the vote?
With only 54% of the popular vote.
Wait, 73% of seats from 54% of votes. How does that even work?
Well, that's the thing. It's a significant disparity that actually exceeds the constitutional limit in Mexico, which is set at 8% for such discrepancies between vote share and seat share. That alone should set off alarm bells in any democratic system.
Yeah, just a bit.
And just to really solidify their grip, they also secured a supermajority in the Senate through what was described as a questionable defection from an opposition party member.
Questionable defections, constitutional limits maybe being ignored. Sounds like parliamentary gymnastics are definitely part of this playbook.
It certainly seems that way. Legislative manipulation appears crucial.
So they're not just winning elections, they're actively trying to skew the playing field for the future, possibly bending or breaking the rules to do it. This sounds like it goes beyond just controlling the legislature, though.
Indeed. Morena also went aggressively after several key autonomous agencies. These are independent bodies meant to provide checks and balances.
Like what?
Well, INAI, for instance. That's the National Institute of Transparency, Access to Information, and Data Protection. Absolutely essential for government accountability, fighting corruption, ensuring the public can see what the government is doing.
Okay, crucial. Who else?
Also, COFACE, the Federal Economic Competition Commission, designed to prevent monopolies and ensure fair markets. CONEVOL, the National Council for Evaluation of Social Development Policy, that's a critical independent body for assessing whether government social programs actually work, plus the Federal Telecommunications Institute and the Energy Regulatory Commission.
Wow, a whole slate of independent watchdogs.
Yeah.
And Morena wanted to eliminate them.
Eliminate them. These measures passed in November 2024. Now, the official justification, the story they told, was all about saving money. Fiscal prudence, you know.
Right. And how much money were these vital agencies costing?
Get this. The stated savings from eliminating all of them. Less than 0.05% of the federal budget.
0.05%.
Less than that.
That's not just a drop in the bucket. That's like microscopic. Barely registers.
Exactly. It's negligible. And this minuscule financial impact, especially when you combine it with the fact that this move came after years of AMLO deliberately hamstringing these agencies by refusing to fill appointments and slashing their budgets anyway.
It makes you seriously question the real motive.
It strongly suggests the true motivation wasn't saving pennies, but eliminating independent oversight, getting rid of pesky watchdogs. These agencies aren't just bureaucratic boxes. They're supposed to be independent checks on executive power. Dismantling them, even with such a flimsy excuse, sends a really clear and alarming signal about who is allowed to hold power accountable in their vision. It's an attack on the very infrastructure of democratic oversight.
Wow. Okay. And the judicial system specifically. That seems to be a particular focus, almost like the grand finale in AMLO's anti-elitist symphony.
Absolutely. Mexico's radical judicial reform, initially proposed by AMLO, then enthusiastically supported and pushed through by Sheinbaum in late 2024. This is an unprecedented move globally. The reform mandates that every single judge in the entire system...
Every single one.
Every single one. That's over 17,000 judicial officers, including all the Supreme Court justices, must now be elected by popular vote.
Elected judges. Elected by popular vote.
It's literally a world first. It completely transforms the nature of how judges get their jobs. And just to add another layer of potential concern,
Oh, I'm sure there's more.
a significant portion of the candidates for these judicial elections, they will be pre-screened by the ruling Morena party.
You're kidding. Pre-screened by the ruling party.
That's what the sources indicate.
So let me get this straight. All judges elected, and the ruling party gets to decide who's even allowed to run in many cases. How does that not raise profound red flags about impartiality, about judicial independence?
One might reasonably ask exactly that. It certainly seems designed to politicize the judiciary entirely.
Who needs an impartial judiciary when you can have a popular one, handpicked by the ruling party?
Oh.
What are the big risks here, according to the analysts?
Well, the dangers cited by the Atlantic Council and Mayor Brown, they're stark and immediate. They argue this reform gravely threatens the fundamental rule of law and judicial independence. It exposes judges to immense political pressure, to the whims of public sentiment. Essentially, it forces them to become politicians, beholden to voters, or maybe more realistically, beholden to the party machinery that gets them elected.
Which likely leads to?
Highly likely to lead to unreliable, maybe ad hoc rulings based on political expediency rather than consistent application of established legal principles. And ultimately, it severely diminishes the judiciary's vital role as a truly independent check on the executive branch. It risks transforming it into just another arm of the political will of the ruling party. The whole idea of judges campaigning for office, it's just deeply unconventional for a system meant to protect rights and laws impartially.
And AMLO's attacks on the judiciary, they didn't just start with this reform, did they? This feels like the culmination of something.
Oh, absolutely. It was the peak of a years-long, sustained campaign to weaken and delegitimize the judiciary. Remember AMLO's earlier moves? He appointed 4 Supreme Court justices during his term, including one described as a party insider with no judicial experience. That immediately eroded confidence in the court's expertise.
Right.
He consistently accused the court of treachery and corruption. He actively encouraged public anger against the court's president. He threatened the pensions of judiciary workers. He dramatically slashed the court's budget. These were all deliberate tactics, softening up the target, delegitimizing it before delivering the final structural blow with this judicial reform.
And what was the immediate impact when this reform passed?
It was immediate and disruptive. Federal judges and magistrates actually went on strike from August to October 2024. That severely disrupted legal proceedings across the country. The Mexican peso also took a hit, fell to a 2-year low, and reports suggested something like $35 billion in foreign investment projects were put on hold.
Because investors like predictability, presumably.
Especially from courts. Unsurprisingly, yes. Investors generally prefer their judges to be less politically motivated and more predictable in how they apply the law. Now, there was a slight glimmer of hope, or maybe just strategic reassurance. Sheinbaum, in her inauguration speech, October 1st, 2024, she did say she would, quote, respect and enhance absolute autonomy and independence of the judicial branch from the president. The legal update we saw points out this message should provide comfort to stakeholders. But, well,
one might wonder if actions will speak louder than those words, especially after such sweeping changes are already locked in place.
One might indeed wonder. We'll have to see how that plays out.
Indeed. Okay, meanwhile, across the border, Donald Trump's ambition to reshape the executive branch that had its own grand blueprint, Project 2025. It sounds less like a campaign platform and more like a comprehensive strategy manual, ready to go on day one.
It's certainly presented with that level of meticulous ambition and, frankly, scope. Project 2025, it was initiated by the Heritage Foundation back in April 2022, collaborating with over 100 conservative groups. And its stated goal, remarkably blunt, building a governing agenda, not just for next January, but long into the future.
That's subtle.
Not subtle at all. Its overarching aim is clearly stated to institutionalize Trumpism and prepare for a White House more friendly to the right. Key leaders like Kevin Roberts, the Heritage Foundation president, have explicitly framed it as the Second American Revolution, adding, with a rather unsettling touch of irony, that it will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
Bloodless if the left allows it. Just
Yes.
oozes goodwill and compromise, doesn't it?
So what's the core idea? You mentioned a dramatic expansion of presidential power. Exactly. At its absolute core, Project 2025 envisions a dramatic expansion of presidential power, pushing way beyond traditional checks and balances. A central and perhaps most controversial component is a plan to fire as many as 50,000 government workers, career civil servants, and replace them with vetted Trump loyalists.
50,000.
That's the figure often cited. It's a move aimed squarely at dismantling what they perceive as an entrenched deep state or administrative state that resists their agenda. Clearly, in this vision, competence takes a back seat when loyalty is the primary, maybe only qualification.
Right, loyalty over experience.
The project is meticulously structured. It's built around 3 pillars that sound like a very detailed crash course in political power grabbing. First, there's the Mandate for Leadership. That's the sprawling, nearly 1,000-page policy book outlining a detailed agenda for pretty much every facet of government.
The blueprint itself.
The blueprint itself. Second, they've built a conservative LinkedIn, basically an online personnel database designed to staff the next administration with thoroughly vetted loyalists, ensuring ideological alignment from top to bottom.
So pre-vetted appointees ready to go.
Ready to slot in. And third, there's a Presidential Administration Academy. This offers training for these potential appointees on how to, and this is their language, seize the gears of power effectively, and specifically how to counter career federal employees who, they fear, might trip us up or obstruct their agenda. It's a comprehensive top-down strategy for asserting maximum executive control, bypassing traditional government structures and personnel.
It sounds less like a policy platform and more like a detailed instruction manual for a hostile takeover of the federal government. And Project 2025, it has some very specific policy goals, right? Aiming to reshape practically everything, from the economy to national security.
They certainly do, and the scope is remarkably broad, incredibly detailed. Let's tick through a few key areas. On the economy, Project 2025 advocates a fundamental shift, eventually maybe, from an income tax system to a national sales tax.
A national sales tax?
Yeah, that's a huge change. In the interim, the plan is to extend the 2017 tax cuts and simplify individual income taxes down to just two flat rates, 15% and 30%. But here's the catch. They'd systematically eliminate most deductions, credits, and exclusions. Which means, according to analyses, this particular shift would likely result in significantly increased tax burdens for millions of low and middle income households. At the same time, they propose substantially reducing the corporate tax rate down to 18% and cutting the capital gains tax rate for high earners to 15%.
So, lower taxes for corporations and the wealthy, potentially higher for almost everyone else. A familiar tune in some circles. And education, what's the vision there? Close the department entirely.
That's explicitly on the table. In education, the plan envisions a significant reduction of the federal government's role, including the potential outright closure of the Department of Education itself. They propose making public funds available as school vouchers with no strings attached.
No strings attached, meaning?
Meaning they could be used even for private and religious schools, effectively directing taxpayer money away from public institutions, potentially without federal oversight or accountability standards. This would be paired with drastic cuts to funding for free school meals and the complete termination of the Head Start program, which provides comprehensive early childhood education, health, and nutrition to low-income families.
Wow, so basically redefining education as a private good, not a public one.
That's exactly the framing. Education as a private rather than a public good. It shifts responsibility and funding away from broad public access towards more selective, often faith-based institutions.
Okay. If education isn't seen as a public good, maybe widely distributed knowledge isn't either, which could be convenient for an authoritarian playbook. All right, what about the environment and climate? I'm sensing a theme here. Green probably isn't their favorite color.
Your intuition serves you well. On environment and climate, the mandate explicitly advises the president to, and I quote, eradicate climate change references from absolutely everywhere within the federal government.
Eradicate references, just pretend it's not happening.
Pretty much. This includes a wholesale abandonment of emissions reduction strategies. They propose abolishing NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which Project 2025 disparagingly calls one of the main drivers of the climate change alarm industry. They also want a significant downsizing of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency.
Downsize or dismantle?
Downsize significantly, close its Office of Environmental Justice entirely, and prevent the agency from using private health data to determine the effects of pollution on communities. Essentially, the approach is, if you don't talk about climate change, if you suppress the data, if you dismantle the agencies studying it, then perhaps, for all practical purposes, it ceases to exist as a policy problem. It's an approach that clearly prioritizes deregulation over environmental protection, rooted in an explicit rejection of established climate science.
A truly innovative approach to problem solving. Make the problem disappear by erasing it.
Okay. And on identity and social issues, what's the plan there? Sounds like a backlash is coming.
Regarding identity, yeah, there's a pronounced backlash against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs right across the federal government. The plan promotes disbanding the White House's Gender Policy Council entirely. It explicitly forbids government agencies from instituting quotas or even collecting statistics on gender, race, or ethnicity.
Stop collecting data. Why? The stated goal is to move toward colorblindness. But critics argue that, in practice, this often means simply ignoring historical inequalities and ongoing systemic biases, which potentially hinders any effort to actually address them. It's essentially a move to roll back diversity initiatives, framed, perhaps paradoxically, as achieving equality through enforced uniformity or blindness to difference.
Right, color blindness that ends up blinding us to real disparities. And finally, national security. I'm picturing a very particular kind of strongman posture here, lots of muscle flexing.
You're not far off. On national security, Project 2025 proposes pressuring NATO members much harder to significantly increase their military spending. It advocates for what's been described as the most dramatic buildup of nuclear weapons since the start of the Reagan administration.
More nukes. Seriously.
Yes. Explicitly rejecting current arms control treaties, and even preparing to potentially test new nuclear weapons, despite the Global Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It signals a clear return to a Cold War-era style of nuclear posturing. Additionally, it aims to abolish DEI programs within the Defense Department and reinstate service members who were discharged for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine. So it's a comprehensive vision combining aggressive nuclear expansion with a very specific cultural and ideological reshaping of the military, emphasizing traditional hierarchies perhaps over diversity initiatives.
It's quite the comprehensive reimagining of American government and its role in the world, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
And speaking of checks and balances, or the lack thereof, the U.S. Supreme Court, it certainly played its part in shaping the landscape for executive power, particularly for someone like Trump. The judicial branch, often seen as that final bulwark, sometimes seems to, maybe inadvertently or perhaps purposefully, clear the path instead.
Indeed. The Supreme Court's decision in Trump v. Casa was really a watershed moment in this context. It significantly limited the ability of federal district judges to issue nationwide injunctions.
Nationwide injunctions. Explain that quickly.
Sure. That was a powerful tool judges could use to halt a controversial federal policy across the entire country while its legality was being challenged. The Casa decision restricted that power dramatically, and that ruling was undeniably a major win for the Trump administration's perspective on executive power. Critics argued it effectively gave a red light to what had been arguably the most effective check on potential illegalities and authoritarian power grabs from the executive. Conversely, it provided a gleaming green light for a president to proceed with potentially illegal actions without facing immediate, broad judicial obstacles.
So a single judge can no longer stop a nationwide policy if they think it's unconstitutional. That sounds profoundly problematic for the whole idea of checks and balances.
It is, by design, from the perspective of those who want stronger executive power. Justice Sotomayor, in a really powerful, stinging dissent, she accused the court's supermajority of outright complicity with efforts to make a solemn mockery of our Constitution.
Strong words.
Very strong. She argued forcefully that by stripping federal courts of this broad injunctive power, the Supreme Court effectively kneecaps the judiciary's authority to stop the executive from enforcing even the most unconstitutional policies. And she highlighted the critical consequence. Under this ruling, judges can now typically only stop a policy for the specific plaintiffs in that one case, leaving the administration free to continue imposing the exact same policy in the other 49 states or across the rest of the country. She called this, flat out, an existential threat to the rule of law because it allows a potentially unconstitutional policy to flourish across the vast majority of the nation while the slow legal process unfolds.
The irony here is almost too much. A court limiting its own power, ostensibly to avoid being imperial, but potentially enabling an imperial executive.
The irony is thick, isn't it? And quite perplexing. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, writing for the majority, warned explicitly about the dangers of an imperial judiciary that oversteps its bounds. Yet critics, like Stephen Greenhouse, writing in Politico at the time, argued the court seemed completely blind to who was the real threat to our democracy, namely a president who has suggested he's above the law. It's a classic case, perhaps, of missing the authoritarian forest for the judicial trees, focusing intensely on perceived judicial overreach, while a potential executive overreach gains speed with a newly unfettered path. The court, in seeking to constrain itself, arguably cleared the way for precisely the kind of power concentration that undermines core democratic principles.
Okay, the stage is now meticulously set, isn't it? Public trust, eroded, institutions undermined, maybe even dismantled, power centralized, or plans laid to centralize it. But these leaders, they aren't just about controlling the mechanics of government, they're also actively creating this fundamental divide, this us against them mindset that seems to consistently fuel their support.
Absolutely. That division is key.
Which brings us to part 3. The U.S. versus them, narrative populism and hostility. It feels like populism 101, but maybe with a particularly sharp, sometimes dangerous twist. all designed to solidify that loyal base against perceived enemies.
Yeah, and this is where the McKinnon paper helps us nail down these crucial terms again. Populist leaders, he notes, they frequently claim to represent the true will of the majority, but in doing so, they often, maybe inadvertently, maybe purposefully, risk marginalizing minorities, silencing dissent.
Right. The people often means my people.
Exactly. And that's a key distinction from true democracy, which ideally aims to represent all voters and actively protect minority rights. Authoritarianism, then, in this context McKinnon discusses, is defined as striving for complete submission from the population. It's about the consolidation of like-minded or similar groups of people, which inevitably, almost by definition, leads to hostility toward those outside of the homogenic group. It's about creating this unified, loyal bloc that views anyone outside its boundaries as an adversary, an enemy, or at best, just an impediment to be overcome.
And Trump's relentless pursuit of this us versus them narrative. I mean, that feels like something many of us witnessed firsthand, almost daily. It felt like his signature move, his absolute bread and butter, creating that unified, almost impermeable base.
It was absolutely foundational to his entire political strategy. McKinnon details several of Trump's key tactics in cultivating exactly this division. First, obviously, his pervasive claims of election fraud. Remember, these began even before he won in 2016. He consistently accused the system of being rigged. And then, conveniently, he blamed the media for pushing what he called false narratives about it.
A neat trick.
A very neat trick. It served this powerful dual purpose. It sowed widespread distrust in the electoral process itself, suggesting it was inherently corrupt, and crucially, it centralized trust in him. Only he could reveal the truth and fix this rigged system. He became the sole trusted arbiter of reality for his followers.
And the anti-elite, anti-establishment rhetoric, that seemed like a constant drumbeat, didn't it?
Oh, constant. That was a masterstroke in his populist appeal. He consistently combined that distrust of institutions with direct, blistering attacks on political opponents. Remember Hillary Clinton? Claiming that big business, elite media, and major donors are lining up behind the campaign of my opponent because they know she will keep our rigged system in place.
The irony being.
The irony, of course, of a self-proclaimed billionaire, a big business owner, a real estate mogul attacking elites and major donors is, well, certainly not lost on observers, but it's a classic populist move. Position yourself as the ultimate outsider, the champion of the forgotten man, fighting against a corrupt, powerful establishment, even if by most objective measures you are deeply entrenched within that establishment. It creates this powerful narrative of victimhood and righteousness for his base. They're against us because we're right.
And then there's Cambridge Analytica. That whole scandal sounds like something straight out of a dystopian sci-fi movie, but it was very real and had potentially a very tangible impact.
Yeah, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, it really highlights what McKinnon describes as a new wave of anti-democratic techniques, specifically for the digital age. This firm notoriously collected data, mostly through Facebook quizzes and apps, on approximately 50 million Americans. And the purpose? To manipulate the fears or concerns of swing voters using highly targeted psychological profiles, and ultimately to incline them to vote for Trump.
So using fear as a political tool digitally.
Precisely. Now, this is an overt, forceful authoritarian coercion, right? It's not sending troops into the streets. But the aim was clearly to consolidate power by influencing behavior through highly targeted psychological manipulation, often tapping into pre-existing anxieties, resentments, maybe even prejudices. It's a chilling digital age twist on consolidating power by subtly shaping public opinion, often operating below the surface of traditional campaigning without direct overt force.
And all of that, the constant rhetoric, the delegitimization, maybe the subtle manipulation, it all kind of culminated, or at least reached a peak, with January 6th, which McKinnon describes starkly as Trump's biggest authoritarian move.
Indeed. January 6th, coupled with the big lie, that persistent false claim that the 2020 election was stolen, it was the most stark, most overt manifestation of these tactics coming together. Trump relentlessly pushed the narrative that the 2020 election was the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. He alleged widespread irregularities. He filed dozens and dozens of lawsuits. Remember all those court cases? A remarkable 62 cases filed, with only a single, very minor win on a technicality.
Right. Overwhelmingly rejected by the courts, including judges he appointed.
Exactly. But even though they were legally unsuccessful, these profound legal losses were skillfully spun. The narrative became, See, even the courts are against him and his people. It further solidified the us versus them mindset among his base, casting the judiciary itself as just another corrupt institution aligned against them.
And on the day itself, January 6th, the rhetoric really shifted gear, didn't it? It went from maybe passive fear to active incitement.
It did dramatically. On January 6th, his rhetoric, particularly at the rally beforehand, it sparked fears of losing the country among his supporters. It created this sense of existential urgency, of imminent threat. What's particularly striking, and McKinnon points this out, is how the us versus them tone flipped. It went from a defensive posture to an offensive one.
Oh, so?
Well, historically, he'd often used it as a fear tactic, right? Suggesting, they're coming after us, protecting the base. But on January 6th, he transformed it into a direct incitement to action. We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. This was a clear, calculated attempt to push his hegemonic base, that consolidated, ideologically aligned group, and frankly, to incite violence because of fear of being one of them. It blurred the lines dangerously between political action and physical confrontation.
And even afterwards, his tone towards the rioters.
Disturbingly gentle and loving, as McKinnon puts it. Telling them, we love you, you're very special. He even seemed to implicitly justify their violence by referring to how others are treated who are so bad and so evil, leaving it ominously vague who exactly those others might be. It's a powerful and incredibly dangerous way to legitimize actions taken by your most loyal supporters, regardless of their legality or violence. It reinforces the U.S. and demonizes the them.
Okay. Shifting back south to Mexico, AMLO, and now his successor Sheinbaum, they've used strikingly similar tactics, according to the sources, to consolidate what McKinnon calls that hegemonic following. It really seems this playbook, or at least these strategies, are well-traveled across national borders.
It truly is, and the parallels are quite disturbing when you lay them out. AMLO, much like Trump, actively creates fear and hostility to those outside of the homogenic group to unify and galvanize his support. One of his most alarming and consistently applied tactics. Attacks on civil society and the press.
Right, the watchdogs again.
Exactly. He openly attacked highly respected, internationally recognized organizations like Article 19 after they courageously exposed government attack on journalists and documented serious violations of freedom of expression in Mexico. This is a classic authoritarian tactic. It's aimed squarely at deflecting accountability and silencing critics, basically turning the tables on those who seek to hold power to account, painting them as the enemy.
And what's the real-world consequence of that kind of attack? It sounds like it goes beyond just harsh words. There are tangible risks involved for those targeted.
The consequences are severe and tragically often deadly. As Access Now points out, citing Amnesty International, this kind of stigmatization can have the effect of inciting government sympathizers against human rights defenders, putting them at further risk, even of physical attacks and killings. These attacks can come from pro-government armed groups or just other non-state actors who feel emboldened by the leader's rhetoric.
We've seen that pattern elsewhere, haven't we?
Sadly, yes. We've seen this tragic pattern play out in other contexts, from Venezuela to Georgia, where these verbal attacks from the top escalate into real physical danger for activists and journalists on the ground. In Mexico, AMLO has been observed to attack the media almost every day. He readily employs Trump's signature fake news charge against critical reporting. His administration has even reportedly used Twitter bots and spurious social media accounts to attack journalists, according to Human Rights Watch. He calls journalists criminals.
Criminal?
Yeah. It's a grim echo of Trump's human scum and enemy of the people epithets directed at the press. It's a direct assault on the Fourth Estate. And it's probably no surprise that Mexico is consistently ranked as one of the most dangerous places in the world for reporters. Journalists there face immense risks, including murder, simply for doing their jobs.
It's genuinely chilling how similar those specific verbal assaults are. Fake news, criminals, enemies, despite the geographical distance, the different political systems, the cultural context. And for both Trump and, interestingly, Vladimir Putin, there's a fascinating link explored in McKinnon's paper, shifting them to what's been called patriarchal populism, or maybe masculine authoritarianism. It suggests a deeper cultural resonance to their appeal.
This is a nuanced but I think highly significant connection that McKinnon highlights. Both Trump and Putin, through their carefully cultivated public displays, the strongman image, the decisive actions, the rhetoric, they have increased a renewed sense of masculinity among their supporters. And notably, their core support bases are predominantly male.
How does that work? What sentiments does it tap into?
Well, it seems to tap into and cater to various underlying societal sentiments and anxieties about gender roles. In Russia, for example, McKinnon suggests it might reflect a longing among some for better days before, say, the massive surge in female labor after World War II, a time when Russia was changing, but not for the better, from a certain traditional male perspective. In the US, it might tap into a similar desire for a return to a perceived past where women were not seen equally in society, a sentiment that aligns quite neatly, doesn't it, with Trump's evocative campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." It's often an appeal to restore traditional gender hierarchies and a perceived natural social order.
So it's a strategic mobilization of traditional gender roles, maybe male anxieties about changing roles, for direct political gain, consolidating support among a specific demographic by appealing to that identity.
Precisely. This mobilization of young male supporters, or traditionalists, as McKinnon puts it, contributes significantly to the homogeneity of support for these leaders. It creates this fiercely loyal, unified bloc, and this solidified base can then be effectively used to push both of their political agendas.
Can you give examples?
Sure. For instance, Trump's judicial appointments, like Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh, they were only possible because of the steadfast support of his base, much of which was animated by these cultural concerns. And those appointments, as we know, directly contributed to the eventual reversal of Roe v. Wade, fulfilling a key agenda point for social conservatives and traditionalists. Similarly, Putin has leveraged his image of, well, what some commentators call toxic masculinity to encourage a more aggressive, uncompromising national stance, as seen perhaps most clearly in his actions toward Ukraine. It's this powerful undercurrent that strengthens the us versus them dynamic by defining the us in very specific, often traditional and exclusive terms. Gender becomes another dividing line.
Okay, so these leaders aren't just about controlling narratives and power structures. They're also masters of spectacle, or at least they certainly attempt to be. Sometimes it's a literal show, a performance designed to project a very specific image of power and national identity. Which brings us to part 4, the grand spectacle and, unfortunately, the human cost that often follows.
Indeed. And Donald Trump in particular seems to possess an almost innate flair for what you could aptly call authoritarian theater. It's about the performance of power.
Authoritarian theater, I like that.
The Guardian and legal United States sources detail his rather, audacious proposal to host a championship-level UFC bout, mixed martial arts.
On the White House lawn.
On the White House grounds itself. Specifically as part of the America 250 celebrations leading up to July 4th, 2026. The plan apparently envisions something like 20,000 to 25,000 spectators packed onto the South Lawn. An unprecedented spectacle for the presidential residence, to say the least. It's hard to imagine a more potent symbol of fusing raw physical power with popular entertainment right there at the seat of government.
I can just picture the pay-per-view numbers for that. A truly unique presidential event. Definitely breaks with tradition.
It certainly fits Trump's well-established pattern of spectacle-driven patriotism, doesn't it? And his penchant for grandiose ideas, which historically included everything from talking about elaborate state fairs to attempts at replicating World's Fair vibes. It's a clear cultural fusion attempt, taking MMA's surging popularity, a sport often associated with physical dominance, aggression, masculinity, and blending it with a grand patriotic display. Critics, naturally, were quick to dismiss it as just a gimmick.
A gimmick, maybe, but a gimmick with a purpose.
Exactly. It's arguably a gimmick with a profound purpose. To project strength, to attract immense public attention, and to skillfully conflate his personal brand, his preferred cultural forms, with national pride and executive power itself. It's a projection of a very specific kind of strongman image, using popular culture as the stage.
But beyond the grand circus, the spectacles, there are often very real, very tragic human costs to these approaches, particularly in how essential services are handled or how human rights are treated. This is where the rhetorical rubber really meets the road, often with devastating consequences.
Unfortunately, yes. This is the sharp end. Human Rights Watch and the Sheinbaum's Mexico source, they highlight AMLO's deeply problematic responses to crises, many of which, again, mirror Trump's, revealing what seems like a shared indifference to widespread human suffering when it becomes politically inconvenient. Consider their COVID-19 response. Both AMLO and Trump actively misinformed the public and downplayed the risks of COVID-19.
Right, I remember that vividly. Dismissing masks, promoting unproven treatments.
Exactly. Both leaders also actively attacked journalists for reporting on the unfolding pandemic. Both continued holding unhealthy public rallies despite clear public health warnings. AMLO, for his part, infamously dismissed expert health advice as just political scheming, suggesting it was all a partisan attack rather than a genuine public health imperative. Unsurprisingly, tragically, Mexico, much like the U.S. under Trump, found itself among the countries with the highest daily COVID-19 death rates globally, a grim testament to the real human cost of such dismissive leadership during a crisis.
A truly grim similarity, affecting millions and highlighting what seems like a shared disregard for scientific expertise when it conflicts with the political narrative. What about immigration and border policy, another highly charged area where rhetoric meets reality?
Yeah, and here the story with AMLO is particularly striking. Despite campaigning as overtly anti-Trump during his election, AMLO remarkably became an enthusiastic partner in Trump's aggressive efforts to effectively shut down the U.S. asylum system.
How so? He seemed so opposed initially.
Actions spoke louder than words. He deployed the Mexican military to Mexico's southern border, effectively acting as a border patrol for the U.S. to intercept migrant families trying to head north. And perhaps most controversially, he signed Mexico onto the highly criticized Remain in Mexico program.
Right, MPP. Forcing asylum seekers to wait in Mexico.
Exactly. Forcing asylum seekers, including incredibly vulnerable families of children, into these dangerous, unsanitary makeshift camps on the Mexican side of the border. In these camps, they face severe risks: kidnapping, extortion, rampant violence from cartels and criminals. Essentially, Mexico became a dangerous holding pen for U.S. asylum processing, all under AMLO's agreement. It demonstrates a very transactional approach to human rights, seemingly trading migrant safety for political expediency or maybe avoiding Trump's wrath.
And both leaders seem to share this particular fondness for using the military in domestic law enforcement roles. That speaks to a certain approach to internal control, doesn't it?
A strong shared affinity, indeed. Both leaders exhibit this pronounced preference for the use of the military in domestic law enforcement over traditional civilian police agencies. AMLO actually formalized a policy in 2019, one that was initiated by a predecessor, it's true, but adopted enthusiastically with the full support of the U.S. government. Interestingly, by changing the Mexican constitution to explicitly allow the military to patrol streets and detain civilians indefinitely.
Allowing the army to act as police.
Essentially, yes. And this policy, over the 14 years it had been unofficially practiced and then formalized, has tragically led to countless incidents of torture, forced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings carried out by military forces against civilians, according to human rights organizations. It clearly shows a willingness to bypass civilian law enforcement structures in favor of direct military control, a tactic often associated with authoritarian regimes, and one that consistently leads to devastating consequences for human rights and basic civil liberties.
And women's rights. Was that also part of this shared pattern of indifference, or maybe even outright hostility?
Sadly, yes. There's a disturbing pattern of what appears to be misogynistic tendencies noted in AMLO's administration as well. He notoriously claimed that most 911 calls reporting domestic violence were fake, just dismissing a widespread, deadly societal problem out of hand.
Fake? Seriously?
That was his claim. He described legitimate questions from journalists and activists about the rising rates of femicide, the gender-motivated killing of women, a huge issue in Mexico, as mere distractions, effectively sidelining a critical human rights crisis. He even proclaimed that feminism itself seeks to change the role of women in a negative light, implying an opposition to basic gender equality. And perhaps most astonishingly, his administration released an official public health campaign that, to prevent domestic violence, simply told would-be abusers to just calm down and count to 10.
That's astonishingly tone-deaf and insulting and dismissive of a grave systemic issue.
It gets even more concerning, if you can believe it. Remember the reports about a cartel extermination camp discovered in Mexico, dubbed the Mexican Auschwitz by some due to the horrific scale of torture and murder alleged there?
Vaguely, yes. Horrifying stuff.
When that news broke, Scheinbaum, incredibly, used the presidential press conference in Mañanera to quibble that it wasn't really an extermination camp, but actually a recruitment site where victims had been lured by fake job offers on TikTok.
She tried to downplay it. An extermination camp.
Downplay it significantly. Now, her security chief did eventually acknowledge the gruesome realities, torture, murder happening at the site. But the ruling Marina Party actively blocked a legislative initiative to create a special commission to investigate this atrocity properly. And when the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances weighed in, expressing grave concern, Sheinbaum simply dismissed them as being ill-informed.
Dismiss the UN.
Dismissed the UN. And all this despite her own family's history of suffering political persecution during the infamous 1968 Tlatelolco student massacre in Mexico City. That personal history makes her administration's callousness and dismissiveness in this case all the more jarring and, frankly, deeply ironic. It illustrates this remarkable capacity to compartmentalize or maybe just ignore human suffering when it conflicts with the government's preferred narrative or image.
It's incredibly difficult to reconcile that kind of personal family history with such a public posture of dismissal towards human rights concerns.
It truly is. And the sources really highlight this stark irony. AMLO frequently claimed to be a humanist. He publicly spoke often about respecting human rights, unlike Trump, who, as the source notes, rarely paid even lip service to such things.
Right. Different rhetoric, same.
Yet, despite their very different rhetorical styles on the subject, both men's actions, according to Human Rights Watch, evinced this profound and callous indifference to the rights of the most vulnerable. Their rhetoric often stood in stark, direct contradiction to their actual policies and the tangible impact those policies had on human lives. It strongly suggests that, for both, such claims were often performative, maybe just for show, rather than reflecting genuine policy priorities or deeply held values.
And sometimes, the human cost of these tactics isn't just about direct human rights abuses or neglect. It's also profoundly economic. International relations get really complicated really fast when leaders start using their authority in, shall we say, unconventional or coercive ways.
That's another key parallel that emerges strongly from this playbook comparison. Donald Trump, as we all remember, famously advocated extreme trade protectionism against Mexico. He went so far as to threaten crippling 25% tariffs on all Mexican goods entering the U.S.
Which would have been devastating for Mexico's economy.
Absolutely devastating. And to avoid this, Sheinbaum, while she was still president-elect, engaged in this critical 45-minute phone call with Trump. During that call, she reportedly committed Mexico to the immediate deployment of 10,000 military forces in the northern border area of the country, specifically to halt migrant flows, essentially doing Trump's bidding on border enforcement.
So, using troops as a bargaining chip against tariffs?
It appears so. And Mexico later went further, agreeing to extradite 29 high-profile cartel leaders to the U.S. This was framed as a security cooperation gesture, but it was clearly aimed at appeasing Trump and demonstrating compliance. A U.S. Justice Department official even openly bragged afterwards that this mass extradition was a consequence of a White House that negotiates from a position of strength.
Wow, so explicit linkage. Security cooperation in exchange for avoiding trade sanctions.
It demonstrates starkly how national security issues like border enforcement, combating organized crime, can be directly leveraged as bargaining chips for trade concessions. It intertwines completely disparate policy areas purely for political leverage, often under duress.
And what was the broader economic fallout for Mexico from all this uncertainty and pressure?
The economic fallout was significant. These actions, driven by Trump's threats and AMLO's subsequent concessions, they led to pervasive economic uncertainty south of the border. Mexico's own central bank actually halved its growth forecast for the country. Approximately $60 billion in foreign investment projects were reportedly frozen or put on hold. Major foreign firms like Volvo and Nissan even began to actively consider withdrawing their manufacturing operations from Mexico altogether.
So, real jobs, real investment threatened.
Absolutely. It's a clear illustration of how this kind of political maneuvering, this transactional approach to international relations, even if it's couched in terms of national interest or fighting crime, can have severe, tangible, and far-reaching economic consequences that directly impact ordinary citizens' livelihoods and a nation's overall economic stability. The ripple effects are huge.
Okay, so after digging through all of this, what have we really learned from this deep dive into the alleged playbooks of Donald Trump and Mexico's ruling Marina Party under AMLO and now Sheinbaum? It's been quite the journey through the strategic underbelly of modern politics.
It really has, and I think we've uncovered several really striking common threads that, when you view them together, they paint a pretty compelling picture of a shared approach to governance. Maybe not an identical carbon-copied playbook, but definitely a shared set of strategies.
What are the big ones?
Well, first, there's the systematic degradation of democratic institutions through that rhetorical trash talk, that calculated effort to convince the public the system is already broken before you try to fix it your way. Second, we saw the strategic centralization of executive power achieved by actively dismantling traditional checks and balances, whether that's through radical judicial reform like in Mexico, or laying out comprehensive plans to completely reshape the federal workforce and agencies like Project 2025 in the U.S.
Okay. Trash talk, centralized power.
Right.
What else?
Third, there's a pervasive cultivation of that divisive us versus them narrative. It's specifically designed to consolidate a loyal power base and demonize any opponents, critics, or independent institutions that might stand in the way. And finally, we saw the use of grand spectacle, the political theater, often coupled with, at times, a deeply concerning disregard for basic human rights and due process, which ultimately comes at a significant human and economic cost for many.
It's almost as if, well, it was as if they've been reading the same script, maybe just in different languages with slightly different accents. The names change, the places change, the specific institutions they target might vary a bit. But the core tactics, the strategic echoes, they really seem to resonate across borders, across political systems. It feels less like some grand conspiracy maybe, and more about a proven set of successful, albeit deeply concerning, strategies for gaining and holding on to power in the modern era.
I think that's a good way to put it. What's truly fascinating and maybe alarming is how adaptable these methods seem to be. Leaders apply them to their specific political and cultural contexts, but the underlying logic often feels very similar. But okay, let's connect this back to the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Why should you, listening right now, care about any of this?
Right. Why does understanding this playbook matter?
Because these aren't just isolated incidents happening somewhere else or only relevant to one political party. They represent a set of methods, a toolkit that, regardless of the political affiliation or the stated ideology of the person using them, can gradually, systematically erode the very foundations of democratic governance anywhere. Understanding these playbooks, recognizing the patterns, the trash talk, the power grabs, the division, the spectacle, it allows you to see past the daily headlines, past the distracting rhetoric. Even when these tactics are dressed up in different costumes or delivered with different rhetorical flourishes, it's about being able to discern the underlying strategic intent, no matter what the surface presentation looks like. It's about critical awareness.
And that raises a really important final question for all of us, doesn't it? If political leaders, on all sides sometimes, are openly discussing their intentions to reshape government and society in such profound ways, whether it's through radical judicial reforms that fundamentally change who judges are beholden to, or through a detailed 1,000-page mandate for leadership that literally spells out their entire transformative agenda down to the smallest detail, what responsibility do we as citizens have? Not just to, read the room and sense the direction things are going, but perhaps, more importantly, to diligently read the fine print, to understand the details of these very public plans that could reshape our lives. It's certainly a lot to mull over as we move forward.
A crucial question indeed.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. As always, keep digging, keep questioning, and always keep being curious.
Until our next deep dive together.
Goodbye for now, and we'll see you next time.